here. Make sure I've got the right thing going here. Yeah, so I want to remind you, first of all, there are, I think, a good number of new people here. If you're new, would you raise your hand or stand up so you can see you and say, welcome? If you don't have a photographic memory and you haven't figured out who raised their hands, many people who are here for the first time have put a blue dot on their badge. So look for the blue dot. And this is a community of people, and we're here to have great conversations, and welcoming in these new perspectives is so important. So thank you to all of you who are, especially who are new, who are coming here. I think for a first-timer, Newsgeist is a bit of a leap of faith, because there's not a typical agenda. In fact, you're going to have to do that work here this evening. There's not a typical program. And so you've had this leap of faith to come here and spend your weekend with us, and I hope that you'll find that it does measure up. We operate Newsgeist under Chatham House rule. So that while we're all here together, we're here together as peers. Your rank and experience and role doesn't really matter here so much as that you're here with perspective and point of view. Chatham House rule, very straightforward. Anything you hear and say here is fair game for others to take home and use, but not for attribution without permission. So learn from one another, take away the wisdom of the conversations, but please, blogging and tweeting and things that require attribution, you want to make sure you have permission to attach someone's name to those comments. So that's the first. The second is our code of conduct. And there are a lot of words on screen. I don't expect you to read them. These code of conduct documents are in all of the rooms as well. The bottom line is just don't be an idiot. You know, if you can just be a nice person while you're here, respect one another, then we're all going to get along. If you feel that you have some concerns, please let me know. But I trust that we will all do just fine together with one another. So, as we do, we like to start these conversations with some insights from Richard. This was a wonderful occasion, and unfortunately the photo's cropped, because what you're missing is that there are at least 4 other drones flying around him in this particular photograph. But the crop makes it seem like it's a yin and yang kind of and I'm sure, Richard, you have some yin and yang things to share with us tonight, so maybe this is the appropriate cropping photo. So I'll turn it over to you. Welcome, crop.
It's an interesting way to get a haircut, because they're all within about a foot of my head at various times. Anyways, it's great to see you all here. First of all, I want to thank Chris. If you haven't met Chris Shipley, and most of you have, she's a truly remarkable individual in general, and quite magical in the way that she manages these affairs. And I know she's going to, after, kind of go through how it works, and we're going to put together a great session of conversations for the weekend, and I'm sure it'll be all superb. So thank you for being here. I, by the way, have been, for the most part, on the road for the last 3 weeks around the world. I'm not sure where I am. If I just fall off the stage, that would probably be why. But it's great to be back here. It's great to meet new people. It's great to see old friends and engage in the kind of thoughtful conversations about all of the interesting matters of the day. And God knows there's no shortage of those. I love conferences because we're enabling these kinds of discussions that cross disciplines, cross roles, cross perspectives. And I've always learned new things here. I was also shocked recently to learn that I'm now in my 70s. Yeah. And it is indeed a shock in many ways. 5 decades in journalism, media, technology, then a broadcaster, an editor, publisher, technologist, a bit of public policy. Which, by the way, simply means that I've made more mistakes than any of you. And it also means that the more I learn, the more questions I have. which again comes back to why these events are, I think, are so extraordinary. But I want to share a couple of thoughts and things that I've observed around the world, and not all happy thoughts, but you were here to talk about serious things as well. So if you might bear with me for a bit. Because I have been back, as I mentioned, to traveling the world, meeting with journalists, publishers, working with various stakeholders on evolving internet policy. It's an extraordinarily illuminating experience, and for me, an unbelievable privilege to be able to do what I do. But these are challenging times. Everywhere I've been, and you know this, probably everywhere you've been, we see struggles to address the fractures in our societies. Deep fissures of ethnic, religious, economic conflict. Frustration with the perceived value of democracy itself. Democracies depend on discourse, and they break down when there's motivation towards consensus is lost. I've learned in those travels that perspectives on free expression vary. I've learned that approaches to governance in open societies vary. I've learned that it's unwise to imply that the form of democracy we use here, for instance, in the United States, is the only incorrect one. I've learned that it's naive to suggest that our First Amendment, for instance, our codification of free expression, is the only and correct one. And I've had more than one individual around the world say, "You guys are kind of nuts." I don't think so, but I understand their perspective. Societies are different. The challenges are different. There's no one size fits all on many of these things. Recently, I got to know an extraordinary journalist by the name of Dapo Olunyami. Oh, somebody knows Dapo. That's fabulous. Dapo spent 13 years in exile from military dictatorships in Nigeria. And then he returned in 2010 and founded the highly regarded Pulitzer-winning Premium Times. He also helped found the Center for Journalism Innovation and Development there. They train journalists, they enable collaborations, they work on new tools. He's a force of nature. And so recently, he invited me to spend a week in Nigeria at their West African Journalism Innovation Conference. It's extraordinary. Hundreds of passionate young journalists and not so young journalists. Truly inspiring. Nigeria today is a young 25-year-old democracy. And unlike our 250-year-old democracy here in the United States, they're not taking it for granted. There was a deep concern about what needs to be done to protect their democratic principles, to protect their press freedom, to advance the role of journalism. But one of Dapo's concerns, deep concerns, is how do we convey the value of journalism to Nigeria's population in this emerging democracy? This population, which, by the way, 2/3 of which is under the age of 25. So Dapo discussed the need for a marketing plan for democratic principles. A marketing plan to promote and describe the role of journalism, the concept of the free press. Seems like a good idea far beyond Nigeria. I think Vivian was just mentioning something that's at our table. No one of us is born with an intrinsic understanding of those concepts. And we need to be very careful in assuming that journalism is indeed understood and valued. What is that term mean for people? I suspect each of us may have very different definitions ourselves. And 2 weeks ago, I was in the Philippines, and I had the great privilege of spending a few extraordinary days with Maria Ressa. One day, just the two of us, spending time in Manila and talking. And with her encouragement, she asked me to give a talk at their Tech for Social Good Summit on the challenging topic of how one might address divisiveness and the lack of trust and the polarization in our societies. Not that I know the answers, and I don't, but it's a question that I've been kind of obsessing on of late, because I can't get to sleep at night. How can we address deep societal challenges if dialogue is stifled by demonization? We live in a world of such deep distrust in institutions, all of our institutions. Media is distrusted, journalism is distrusted, tech is distrusted, governments are distrusted. 9 years ago, Sally Laren, who I think is with us this weekend, she's not here yet. She's here. Founded the Trust Project here in Phoenix. Sally has been determined in her efforts to understand that problem of trust and guide news organizations on how to build trust. An extraordinary, noble, and ongoing effort. But when I worked with her on it at the very beginning, and we together kind of came up with that name, but I think I misunderstood the problem. We don't have a deficit of trust. Everyone trusts someone. Everyone trusts some sources of information, whether we think those sources are trustworthy or not. Put the question in a different way. In the world of journalism, of course, back to that very special word, has never been solely about fact-based coverage. We often talk about it as being about the truth. Well, whose truth? What truth? Truth is, there aren't that many things in the world that are absolute. So many things, particularly in the world of politics and current events, are about perspectives. There's always been varying degrees of partisanship, which is its own challenge, right? The left-leaning news brand is despised by the right, and the right-leaning news brand is despised by the left, both leaning more towards affirmation than information. And sadly, fact-based journalism, drowned in that flood of opinion, can't find its own footing. That's a challenge. How do we deal with that in a polarized world? How do we address the challenge of the other without being perceived as someone else's other? Some of you might remember Monica Guzman, who was at Newsgeist with us several years ago. Extraordinary woman, Mexican-American journalist, who wrote a wonderful book looking at it through the lens of her own sharply divided family. It's called, I Never Thought of It That Way, How to Have Fearlessly Curious Conversations in Dangerously Divided Times. We can't find common ground without learning how to listen to each other, is her point. How do we listen to each other, even in the most difficult of conversations? Even when you think the person on the other side of the table is insane, and they think you're. How to stop that? How to bridge that divide? I spent time with Janet Coates, a linguistics researcher and managing director of the Consortium on Trust in Media and Technology at the University of Florida. She's with us here this weekend. And when I talked with her several weeks back, she shared the work she's doing looking at the coverage of racial justice protests, specifically regarding the murder of George Floyd in 2020. And she pointed out, and I quote, the words quite literally scorched off the page. The verbs used to describe protest actions repeatedly drew comparisons to fire or destruction, such as spark and fuel, erupt, trigger. She begs the question, is the recurrent use of this fiery language in our own news coverage a deliberate choice, or is it simply a subconscious pattern in covering these stories? And what impact does that have on the perception of these demonstrations and those who mount them? How might that fuel a partisan divide? And it's an interesting question. Politicians, as we all know, spend millions on linguistics. Maybe we all need to study linguistics as well. Janet is going to want to have those conversations this weekend, and I look forward to them. Another question I've struggled with for a long time is, how might we avoid amplifying societal fears? You know, in the United States, one is 400 times more likely to die in a traffic accident than an act of terrorism, 35 times more likely to die of cancer or heart disease than from a violent crime, or any form. But you know, all research says it's the reverse. Our societies perceive those fears in reverse. Our fear of terrorism is exponentially higher than our fear of dying in our cars. We live in what's called a landscape of distorted risk. Every day, when we read about violent crime, kidnappings, refugee flows, it happens. It's the horrific and anomalistic stuff that journalism needs to cover. But how does our society learn of these things without molding perceptions of reality that conflict with actual reality? Is there an increase in violent crimes, or in my community, or is it a rare occurrence? Obviously, it can be both. More often, it's not necessarily a trend. But if I enter a polling booth with that distorted sense of societal risk, how does that not skew how I consider issues and candidates? We know this, right? We know the nature of politics. We know how easy it is to drive with fear versus hope. But how might we close that gap between irrational fear and rational fear? Several years ago, I began a project at Google we've been doing this for a long time, that built a data commons coalescing statistical data from authoritative sources, normalized it. The idea and the hope was, could we make those kinds of resources easier for journalists to find, for users to find, for that matter, but for journalists to find and offer appropriate context? I think it's a valid question. And we worked on that, but it was hard to get it into the workflows, and that's understandable. But it has occurred to me that among the many, maybe smart applications of generative AI as a reporter's assistant would be to surface that kind of information and make it easier for you to consider to add it into a story I was writing. Worth considering. I took note also recently of a mega study, a study of studies coordinated by Stanford University on what types of interventions would decrease political polarization. There were two approaches that stood out significantly among all others. And they're both interesting in that they are quite relevant, I think, to our world of journalism, to any of us who are working in the information space. First, one is to leverage the value of empathy by highlighting relatable, sympathetic exemplars of different political beliefs, as compared to, for instance, the high conflict personalities we see too often in politics and media. Now, I know that's easier said than done, but it's worth considering. And I know David Walmsley, who was supposed to be here and couldn't, the editor of the Globe and Mail in Canada, is looking at that question. I know that my good friend Stephen Hayes at the Dispatch is thinking about that question. How do we kind of help people look at those who disagree with in a different way? The other invention is to leverage similarity by highlighting common cross-partisan interests. Does the news publication feature content about non-controversial topics of common interest? That actually is really long proven to work well in local news, right? Where the value of service journalism on local sports, on community events, on the progression of life from birth to obituary can drive engagement, can unify a community, and research shows can build trust for the coverage of more controversial topics. Maybe, by the way, that's the justification for the Taylor Swift correspondents that some news organizations are hiring. If it works, it's worth doing. Now, I raise these questions, not just questions for the journalism community, of course. It goes far beyond that. How do others do their part? How does Google do its part? How can algorithms, and these are tricky questions, how can algorithms, and for that matter machine learning and artificial intelligence, reflect a society's ideals and principles, whether to surface relevant and authoritative search results, or to support applications of generative AI that can help address our societal challenges and reduce the risks of harm. And how do we do that without being perceived to pick sides? How do we do that without being perceived to be the other? You know, the one thing I've learned in my time at Google is you could never really get it right. And maybe that was, I wouldn't work in television once. I always remembered, like, if the viewer mail sort of dropped equally on both sides, that you were probably doing the right thing. In any case, I think these are the kinds of questions we need to consider. I've been reading more history of late. I'm trying to be the student at 71 that my parents had hoped I would be at 17. And I've learned we're not very good at learning. History tells us that polarization stretched to the breaking point doesn't end well. And you can go all the way back to the Greeks on that one. The only thing that's changed, and it has changed, and we know it, which is one of the reasons why we're all here, is that over time, communications technology, in its every step forward, it just made it all happen faster. Which makes it all even scarier. So, the solutions, of course, are neither clear, nor singular, nor easy. But my own path to optimism, and I've joked before, and I'll use this joke maybe for the last time, maybe not. I've always been the glass half full person, and now I say I still am a glass half full person, except that it needs to be vodka. But my own path to optimism, I can only get there to the extent that I can engage and find people who engage in constructive conversations in how we get there. And that's why I'm here. So I thank you for listening, because this is really just my own soul bearing with where we are in the world. And I thank you for helping me get through it, and maybe helping all of us get through it. Thanks again.